He had everything: money, power, respect, and a wife the world admired. But the one woman who truly saw him was a housekeeper everyone ignored. When his wife noticed a shift, she didn't argue, she didn't scream, she planned. What happened next destroyed lives, exposed secrets, and changed power forever. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end the way you think. By 36, Ethan Cole had rewritten the rules of power without ever touching politics or wearing a uniform. He built gods out of code, systems so intelligent they didn't just respond to the world, they anticipated it. His software predicted market crashes weeks before economists saw the signs, flagged geopolitical risks before diplomats reacted, and optimized corporate empires with ruthless efficiency. Governments licensed his technology quietly. Corporations begged for access publicly. His name moved markets. His silence scared competitors. From the outside, Ethan Cole was untouchable. From the inside, he was hollow. His mansion sat on a cliff overlooking the city, all glass walls and cold marble, designed to look like victory. At night, the lights below glittered like a constellation he no longer felt part of. He often worked late in his private office, staring at lines of code that once thrilled him but now felt like echoes of an obsession that had consumed everything else. The house was too quiet for a place this expensive. No laughter, no warmth, just a faint hum of systems running perfectly, efficiently, endlessly, much like his life. Ethan's marriage had once been a headline maker, a brilliant tech founder marrying a stunning, socially powerful woman. They were called a power couple before that phrase lost meaning. But power, Ethan had learned, didn't equal connection. Veronica was always somewhere important. Charity galas, investor dinners, political fundraisers, a schedule filled with events that kept her visible and admired. They shared calendars, not conversations. Bedrooms, not intimacy. Promises, not presents. Some nights, Ethan ate alone at the long dining table, scrolling through reports on his tablet while untouched food cooled in front of him. Other nights, he skipped meals entirely. He told himself hunger sharpened focus. Loneliness was just another distraction to overcome. That lie worked for years, until it didn't. The night everything began to change wasn't dramatic. No thunder, no breaking news. Just fatigue pressing heavier than usual. Ethan left his office past midnight, loosening his tie, his mind buzzing with unresolved problems. As he passed the kitchen, something stopped him. Sound. Soft. Unexpected. Someone was humming. The melody wasn't polished or confident. It was quiet, almost private, like it wasn't meant to be heard. Ethan stood still, listening. The kitchen lights were dimmed, warm against the darkness. At the counter stood the house's cook, Maya Reyes, her back turned, sleeves rolled up, hair tied simply, moving with an ease that felt out of place in such a cold house. She didn't notice him at first. She was focused, present, grounded in a way Ethan hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat lightly. Maya startled, quickly turning, apology already forming on her lips. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize anyone was still awake." Ethan shook his head. "You're fine. I just didn't expect anyone here this late." "I usually prep meals for the morning," she said softly. Her voice matched the humming, calm, unforced. "You work late." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. That alone unsettled him. "Yes," he said, "I do." She nodded, returning to her task, not trying to impress him, not filling the silence with nervous chatter. Ethan should have left. Instead, he leaned against the counter, drawn by the strange comfort of her presence. They exchanged a few polite words. Nothing personal, nothing inappropriate. Yet when Ethan finally went upstairs, something inside him felt different. Not excited, not guilty, just awake. For the first time in a long time, he slept without dreaming of numbers. Veronica Cole understood power the way surgeons understood anatomy. She knew where to cut, where to apply pressure, where to smile. She had built her identity carefully long before marrying Ethan, polished, admired, indispensable. Becoming Mrs. Cole didn't make her powerful. It amplified her reach. She curated Ethan's image, guided his public appearances, filtered who had access to him. People thought she was supportive. In truth, she was strategic. Veronica believed marriage was a partnership of advantage. Love was optional. Control was not. She didn't mind Ethan's long hours, They kept him predictable. She didn't mind his emotional distance. It gave her freedom. What she did mind was unpredictability. And lately, something had shifted. She noticed it first in the smallest details. Ethan stopped answering her messages instantly. He declined an event she'd already committed him to. He seemed distracted when she spoke, his attention drifting not to work, but inward. That bothered her more than anger ever could. She prided herself on knowing everything that happened in her house, her marriage, her world. Veronica reviewed staff schedules, security logs, even camera placements, not because she suspected infidelity, but because she hated blind spots. That's when she noticed the cook, Maya Reyes. Quiet, efficient, rarely complained, rarely spoken less spoken to. The kind of employee people forgot existed, the kind Veronica usually ignored, until she didn't. One afternoon, Veronica returned early from a luncheon and found Ethan in the kitchen, talking, laughing. It was brief, casual, but it ignited something cold and sharp inside her. Not jealousy, possession. That space, his attention, belonged to her, whether she used it or not. That night, Veronica ordered a discreet upgrade to the mansion's internal monitoring system under the guise of security optimization. She didn't need to watch everything. She just needed to know enough. Information was leverage. Always had been. She began observing patterns. Ethan lingered in the kitchen more often. He asked Maya questions, not personal, but curious, about recipes, about music, about books. It wasn't an affair. Not yet. But Veronica understood something dangerous was forming. Emotional connections were harder to control than physical ones. They slipped through rules, through contracts, through power. Veronica smiled through dinners, kissed Ethan's cheek before bed, and quietly began planning. Maya Reyes had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. Silence was safer. Observation was survival. She moved through the cold mansion like a shadow, doing her work thoroughly, professionally, without drawing attention. That had always been the goal. This job wasn't about ambition. It was about stability, about rebuilding a life that had collapsed years earlier. Once, Maya had dreams, real ones. She studied engineering in college, top of her class, obsessed with systems and logic, fascinated by how small inputs could change entire outcomes. Her father ran a small tech repair business until a partner betrayed him, forged documents, and left the family ruined. Lawsuits dragged on. Money disappeared. Her father fell sick under the stress. Maya dropped out to support her family. Dreams turned into responsibilities. Potential turned into regret. By the time she joined the Coles household, Maya had accepted that her brilliance belonged to a past life. Cooking paid the bills. Silence kept her employed. She didn't resent it. She endured it. Ethan's presence unsettled her because he noticed things. Not in a predatory way. In a human way. He listened. He asked why she chose certain ingredients, not just how they tasted. He thanked her, actually thanked her. That wasn't dangerous by itself. What scared Maya was how easily she began to look forward to those moments. How his exhaustion mirrored her own quiet grief. She kept boundaries firm. Always respectful. Always distant. When Ethan mentioned once that she seemed too sharp to be working there, she deflected with a smile. Everyone ends up where they're needed, she said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the full truth. Maya didn't know about the cameras. She didn't know about Veronica's scrutiny. She only knew that something fragile and unspoken was forming, and fragile things broke easily in places ruled by power. And in a house built on glass, nothing stayed hidden for long. Maya stopped waiting for fairness the night she realized no one was coming to fix what had been taken from her. Anger sharpened her focus the way fear never could. She rebuilt herself quietly the same way she once rebuilt broken devices in her father's shop, piece by piece. She reached out to old classmates she had been too ashamed to contact, discovered how many of them still remembered her brilliance, still owed her favors, still respected the mind she had buried to survive. She worked out of borrowed spaces and late-night cafes, writing code that solved problems most startups avoided. She didn't chase investors, she built proof. Systems that exposed inefficiencies in data security and corporate audits, the very mechanisms that had been used to destroy her. Each line of code felt like reclaiming something stolen. Meanwhile, Ethan unraveled The more he investigated, the more he saw how carefully the narrative against Maya had been shaped. Emails timed perfectly, alerts framed just, vaguely enough to avoid blame. He realized Veronica hadn't acted out of panic but precision. The woman he married hadn't protected him, she had used him, and that truth sat heavy in his chest. When he confronted her again, she accused him of being sentimental, of romanticizing a staff member who had clearly crossed boundaries. Ethan understood then that Veronica didn't feel guilt because guilt required seeing people as equals. He slept in his office at night for the first time since founding his company, staring at the city, wondering how easily power blinded him to humanity. And across town, Maya filed paperwork under a new company name, one no one associated with her past, one that would soon force the world to learn it. The tech world moved fast, but not fast enough to see Maya coming. Her startup launched without noise, no press releases, no flashy founders, just performance. Companies began adopting her software quietly because it worked. It detected manipulation inside internal audits, exposed false compliance trails, highlighted data tampering patterns executives swore didn't exist. Investors followed results, not stories, and the money came quickly. Ethan noticed a shift when clients delayed renewals, citing a superior alternative. He dug deeper and felt his breath catch when he saw the architecture, elegant, ruthless, familiar. It was a kind of mind he once recognized instantly, the kind he had failed to protect. Veronica noticed too, but dismissed it until market analysts started whispering the same name. The anonymous founder was scheduled to speak at the Global Tech Integrity Summit, a closed-door event attended by regulators, CEOs, and the press elite. Veronica insisted Ethan attend, framing it as an opportunity to reassert dominance. But unease followed him there. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation when the keynote speaker was announced, and when Maya walked onto the stage, the room froze. She looked nothing like the woman they had escorted out with a suitcase. Her presence was calm, commanding, undeniable. Ethan felt pride collide with shame so violently he couldn't breathe. Maya didn't look at him at first. She spoke about truth hidden behind systems, about how power, often weaponized process against people without voices, and every word felt aimed at the house on the cliff and the woman seated beside him. Maya ended her presentation by doing what no one expected. She demonstrated her software using anonymized but unmistakable case studies, exposing how fabricated alerts and strategic audits could be used to remove individuals without evidence. The room shifted from admiration to outrage as familiar corporations recognized their own methods mirrored on screen. Then she named it abuse of structural power. She didn't accuse individuals, but truth doesn't need names to land. Journalists leaned forward. Regulators exchanged looks. Veronica felt the first flicker of panic she had felt in years. Ethan watched as the world finally saw what he had missed. During the Q&A, a reporter asked Maya why she built the company, and she answered without emotion that she built it because silence almost erased her, and she refused to let systems reward cruelty ever again. She looked at Ethan then, not with longing but finality. The applause that followed wasn't for innovation alone, it was for justice. Articulated clearly. Backstage, chaos erupted as executives scrambled to distance themselves. Veronica tried to leave but was stopped by federal agents acting on warrants triggered by the very evidence Maya's platform had uncovered. Cameras captured her shock as her composure fractured in public. Ethan stood frozen, realizing that the woman he failed had not returned for revenge but for truth, and that truth had just dismantled everything built on lies. The arrest of Veronica Cole spread faster than any press release Ethan's company had ever issued. Footage of her being escorted through the summit corridors played on every screen by nightfall. The woman once praised for elegance, now reduced to clipped explanations and controlled panic. Charges piled quickly: conspiracy, obstruction, financial manipulation, abuse of corporate governance. None of it looked exaggerated once investigators followed the data trail Maya had exposed. Ethan issued a brief statement distancing himself, but silence screamed louder than denial. Board members demanded answers, investors froze accounts, regulators requested full access to internal systems. The empire Ethan built on trust and innovation was suddenly associated with rotten complicity. He resigned as CEO within 48 hours, not as a strategy, but as a necessity. His name was too close to the scandal. Meanwhile, Veronica's legal team collapsed under the weight of evidence that couldn't be spun away her. Power had always depended on control and narrative was gone. Maya watched the fallout from a quiet office with no satisfaction, only resolve she hadn't built her company to destroy lives, but she would not shield those who destroyed Hayes. She authorized full cooperation with authorities, knowing every disclosure widened the net. Ethan tried to contact her through intermediaries, through lawyers, through mutual connections, but she refused all communication, not out of bitterness, but Clarity, some doors once closed should remain that way. The world framed her as a whistleblower turned innovator and framed him as a fallen genius learning consequences too late. Ethan stood alone on the stage weeks later at a separate public forum, one not curated, one not protected by PR filters. His company logo removed, his title stripped, his voice unguarded. He spoke not to reclaim power but to return accountability. He admitted his failure to question systems that favored him and crushed others, admitted that silence in the face of injustice made him complicit regardless of intent. He named no one, but everyone understood who he meant. Analysts called it career suicide, some investors called it betrayal, but the public listened because it was raw and unscripted. Somewhere in the crowd, Maya watched unnoticed for the first time, by choice not circumstance. She didn't expect his apology, and she didn't need it, but she recognized truth when she heard it. Ethan ended his speech by acknowledging that the most brilliant mind he had ever encountered worked in his kitchen, and he failed to protect it. The room erupted not in applause, but stunned silence, because humility was rare in men who once held godlike influence. Maya left before questions could follow. She didn't want closure through him. She already had it through herself. Yet something shifted that day. Ethan lost the last remnant of his old identity, but gained something quiet to self-awareness that no success metric could measure. Months passed, and the world adjusted the way it always did. Scandals cooled, new faces rose, market stabilized. Maya's company became a standard-bearer for ethical tech adopted by governments and corporations that wanted credibility restored. She expanded slowly, deliberately, refusing buyouts, refusing to become another tool of unchecked power. She hired quietly, valuing integrity over pedigree. Ethan faded from headlines and into mentorship funding programs for overlooked innovators operating without public recognition. He didn't seek redemption through Maya because redemption demanded change, not reunion. When they crossed paths once at a closed industry workshop, there was no tension, only mutual acknowledgement of paths diverged permanently. Veronica's name became shorthand for overreach and downfall, a cautionary tale taught in business schools stripped of glamour. The mansion on the cliff was sold, its glass walls no longer reflective of victory but illusion. Maya moved into a modest space filled with light and unfinished ideas, smiling more freely than she ever had in luxury. She had not won a man, she had won herself, and that was the ending no one saw coming, but everyone felt was earned. The world eventually grew tired of outrage the way it always did and moved on to the next spectacle, but the people at the center of the collapse did not get that luxury. Ethan woke each morning to silence that felt heavier than chaos ever had. No assistants waiting, no alerts demanding decisions, no urgent meetings validating his importance. Just time and memory and the relentless awareness of who he had been when it mattered most. He downsized into an apartment overlooking nothing remarkable and learned to cook his own meals, discovering how foreign patience felt when it wasn't optimized for profit. Nights were the hardest because ambition had once filled him completely, and now there was room for reflection he hadn't prepared for. He replayed moments with Maya, not romanticizing them, but dissecting them, trying to locate the exact point where courage failed him and convenience won. Meanwhile, Maya navigated a different kind of pressure. Her company grew faster than she wanted, and attention followed her everywhere. Interviews, speaking invitations, profiles painting her as fearless or vengeful depending on the outlet. Neither felt accurate. She avoided telling her story in full because she didn't want pain to become branding. She spent long evenings reviewing proposals, rejecting those that smelled like control disguised as partnership. Success no longer thrilled her, it grounded her because it was earned on her terms. Sometimes she remembered the mansion not with bitterness, but clarity, realizing how small she had made herself to survive inside a world that never intended to see her fully. And though the storm had passed, the echo of it reshaped everything they touched. What the headlines never captured was how slowly transformation really happened. Ethan did not become noble overnight, and Maya did not become untouchable just because the narrative crowned her victorious. Ethan struggled with resentment toward himself, toward systems he once designed, without thinking of who they crushed beneath efficiency. He funded programs, quietly placing resources into communities that mirrored Maya's past, not to erase guilt but to redistribute opportunity. He listened more. Then he spoke, learned to sit with discomfort without solving it. Maya, on the other hand, faced loneliness she hadn't anticipated. Power isolated her differently than poverty ever had. People approached her now with expectations, agendas, projections of strength she didn't always feel. She missed anonymity but refused to return to invisibility. She built a culture inside her company where silence was questioned and authority was earned repeatedly, not assumed. She told her team about failure openly. about how brilliance meant nothing if you allowed fear to make you complicit. Their power crossed indirectly more often than either expected through shared initiatives, through policies rewritten, through standards change. They never spoke directly, and that distance became a form of respect, acknowledging that some connections are meant to awaken you, not accompany you. Veronica's trial unfolded quietly behind closed doors, stripped of spectacle and glamour, and when sentencing came it felt anticlimactic compared to the damage already done. Her greatest punishment wasn't prison, it was irrelevance in a world she once controlled. The imbalance corrected not through revenge but through removal. Years passed, not loudly but steadily, the way real change always does, and the world that once reduced Maya Reyes to a headline learned to live with the system she reshaped quietly beneath its feet. Her company no longer needed introductions. Its principles were taught in universities, cited in policy meetings, and referenced whenever conversations turned ethical power. Yet Maya herself remained intentionally distant from spectacle. She declined most interviews, spoke only when the message mattered, and refused to let pain become performance for applause. When asked what moment truly changed her life, she surprised people by choosing something small. She spoke about the night she walked away with one suitcase and no certainty, and decided she would never again negotiate her worth for survival. She said that was a moment fear lost its grip. That was a moment she stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. Those words traveled farther than any product launch because they reached people who felt unseen in their own lives. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole lived a quieter existence that few recognized as transformation because it lacked drama. He no longer chased influence and no longer measured his days by outcomes alone. He mentored without branding, funded without credit, and listened without assuming solutions. He learned to sit in rooms where he held no authority and found that humility carried a strange kind of freedom. The guilt he once carried softened into responsibility, not self-punishment, but awareness. When he thought of Maya, it was not with longing but respect, understanding that some people enter your life to reveal who you are, not who you will keep. He watched her rare interview from a distance, noticing not her success but her ease, the way she occupied space without apology, and he knew that was a victory no one could take from her. Veronica's name faded into footnotes, mentioned only as caution, stripped of mystique and power because history has little patience for those who confuse control with strength. The mansion on the cliff changed owners several times, its glass walls reflecting different lives, none of which knew the silence it once held. And Maya, standing in a sunlit office, surrounded by voices that challenged her, not feared her, understood something fundamental, that power gained through fear collapses, but power built through truth endures. She had not won a man, she had not chased revenge, she had won alignment with herself. And that alignment reshaped everything she touched. The story did not end with reconciliation or regret or triumph shouted from rooftops. It ended the way real endings do, with lives redirected, system corrected, and a quiet certainty that some choices echo longer than love ever could. Time did not heal everything, but it clarified what mattered and what never did. Maya learned that truth once released does not simply settle, it travels, reshaping landscapes quietly and relentlessly. Governments began rewriting procurement rules inspired by a company's framework. Corporations adopted transparency not out of virtue but necessity because markets now demanded it. She resisted becoming a symbol because symbols were easy to admire and easier to ignore. Instead, she focused on building systems that forced accountability even when no one was watching. Her days filled with decisions that carried weight beyond profit, hiring leaders who challenged her, questioning her own authority repeatedly, so she never became what she once fought. Some nights exhaustion returned, but it was different now, purposeful rather than draining. Ethan, on the other hand, discovered how invisible one becomes without power, and how revealing that invisibility could be. He attended conferences where he was no longer escorted to the front row, listened to conversations where his opinion was optional, and learned to appreciate the honesty of being unimportant. He built a quiet foundation, funding young innovators with strict conditions: no silence, no unchecked authority, no loyalty bought with fear. When asked why he stayed out of the spotlight, he answered simply that visibility once cost him his courage, and he was not eager to trade humility for relevance again. Their influence moved on parallel lines, never intersecting but undeniably connected by the shift they had sparked. The world after truth was not gentler, but it was sharper, less forgiving of manipulation, and more demanding of integrity. There were consequences that could not be erased no matter how well the story resolved, and both Maya and Ethan learned to live with them honestly. Maya carried the memory of being dismissed, escorted out, judged without defense, and those memories surfaced unexpectedly in moments of doubt, reminding her how quickly safety could vanish. She did not suppress them, she integrated them, letting pain inform vigilance rather than fear. Ethan carried the knowledge that he had failed someone when his voice mattered most, and that knowledge stayed with him not as punishment but as a compass guiding future choices. They both understood that some losses were permanent. Trust once broken does not regenerate, it teaches instead. Veronica's absence from public life became complete, her appeals failed, her networks dissolved, and those who once praised her distanced themselves, rewriting history to exclude her influence entirely, proving how conditional loyalty always was, the culture that had enabled her. Behavior faced scrutiny and slow reform, not dramatic enough for headlines, but meaningful enough to last. Maya refused to celebrate her downfall, publicly believing that justice without dignity becomes another form of abuse. Ethan supported reforms anonymously because he had learned that doing right without recognition was the only apology that mattered. The past could not be undone, but its grip loosened as different choices accumulated quietly. Legacy did not arrive the way people imagined it rarely did. It was not announced with trophies or standing ovations or flattering profiles written by people who arrived after the risk had passed. It revealed itself quietly over time in the absence of certain injustices and the presence of protections that had not existed before. Maya learned this as she watched policies change in rooms she was not invited into and safeguards appear in systems she did not personally oversee yet still recognized as extensions of her work. Her company became a reference point not because of branding, but because its principles refused to bend even when bending would have made growth faster and easier. She spent long hours questioning her own authority, deliberately creating friction around her decisions because she understood how easily power softened into entitlement when unchallenged. She built leadership structures that limited her control rather than expanded it, knowing that the moment the system depended solely on her judgment, it became fragile. She spoke often to young engineers about the difference between brilliance and courage, explaining that intelligence without boundaries turns into obedience dressed as innovation, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not neutrality but alignment. These conversations echoed through classrooms, incubators, and workshops long after she left the room, shaping minds that would never know her personal story yet live by its lessons. Ethan observed these changes indirectly through the programs he supported, quietly noticing how differently this new generation spoke about accountability compared to his own rise where speed was praised and consequences outsourced. He participated not as a leader but as a witness, answering uncomfortable questions about failure, about the seduction of convenience, about how easily good intentions dissolve when power goes unchecked. He never defended himself and never reframed his past as necessary suffering. He allowed it to remain what it was, a warning. The world did not become just overnight, but it became less tolerant of abuse, less impressed by polish, more suspicious of perfection. Veronica's absence remained complete not as vengeance, but as erasure of influence, proving that control once exposed does not survive daylight. And Maya, standing in an ordinary office filled with unfinished ideas and uncelebrated work, understood that she had not merely survived a system designed to erase her, she had altered a trajectory so that others would not need to fight the same battle. The legacy still forming was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who would move through those systems with more protection, more voice, and less fear than she once had. And that knowledge settled into her not as pride, but as peace. There came a moment years later when the past knocked not loudly but persistently in a way that demanded acknowledgement rather than reaction. Maya received an invitation to serve on an international ethics council that would shape how emerging technologies were governed for decades, and the offer came with conditions, visibility, compromised political alignment, and subtle expectations that she soften her stance to consensus. It was a kind of opportunity people dreamed of, the kind that validated struggle with authority and permanence. But Maya recognized a familiar pressure immediately, the quiet attempt to absorb her into a structure that valued her voice only as long as it remained convenient. She took time to decide, retreating from noise, returning to the grounding routines that had sustained her before power arrived, walking alone, thinking deeply, remembering how easily ambition once masqueraded as purpose. Ethan faced his own moment when a consortium of investors offered to reinstate him as a figurehead, promising redemption, narrative, controlled influence, and restored prestige. It was framed as forgiveness, as progress, as proof that the system could correct itself. But Ethan saw the truth beneath it. They wanted the appearance of humility without its substance, a lesson without the cost. Both stood separately at crossroads that mirrored each other, and both chose restraint over return. Maya declined a council position, publicly explaining that real accountability could not be overseen by those invested in managing perception rather than preventing harm. Ethan declined a reinstatement without announcement, choosing to remain where he was effective without authority. The world barely noticed these decisions because they lacked spectacle, but they mattered more than any summit or scandal because they confirmed that growth was no longer theoretical, it was lived. Those choices sealed the transformation, not with applause, but with integrity, and the story continued quietly exactly where it needed to be. In the end, there was no final confrontation, no reunion, no dramatic reconciliation, because life rarely delivers meaning in neat circles. Instead, there were parallel lives shaped permanently by shared rupture and the choices made afterward. Maya built something that outlived her named systems, that spoke when others were silenced, frameworks that made abuse harder and courage easier. She lived without excess, without fear, without shrinking, and that alone was victory. Ethan lived without the illusion. That brilliance excused silence, and without the hunger for dominance that once defined him, he became something quieter and more durable, a witness, a supporter, a reminder that accountability begins where justification ends. The world moved forward imperfectly, but altered its blind spots. Fewer people were erased quietly, fewer truths buried under procedure, fewer lives broken without consequence. When future generations studied the shift, they would not focus on scandal or downfall, but on the structural changes that followed, and the individuals who refused to benefit from injustice even when it was offered back to them. The story that once began with imbalance and betrayal ended not with triumph, but with alignment, and that alignment endured beyond attention, beyond headlines, beyond memory itself. Because when power is redefined through courage rather than control, what remains is not legend but lasting change.